Here is something about this story that feels almost impossible when you first see the dates. On April 9th, 1952, a woman who had been queen for only 8 weeks signed a formal declaration that would keep her husband's surname away from his own children. Nearly 69 years later, on April 9th, 2021, that same husband died at Windsor Castle, just 2 months before his 100th birthday. The country then spent days speaking about him under a name that had been given to him, rather than the identity he had been born with. Same date, nearly 7 decades apart. And as far as the public knows, nobody inside that family ever openly discussed that strange connection. I checked the dates because details like that matter. Both are correct, and once you see them, they sit underneath the entire story. Before we go any further, let me explain what this is. This is not the polished version of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth's marriage that usually gets repeated. The popular story is simple. A young princess meets a handsome naval officer. They fall in love, they marry, they remain together for 73 years. Eventually he retires to a quiet life in the countryside. That version is not completely false, but it leaves out a great deal. There are official documents. There are decisions made behind closed doors. There is a man who gave up his country, his religion, his royal titles, and even his original identity before marrying the future queen. And there is one small object that he kept with him for almost his entire life: a ring. He wore it every day for 77 years. And once you understand what happened to his name, his career, his home, and even his children, that small ring begins to mean something very different. First, though, there is one common belief that needs to be corrected. You may have heard people say that Philip and Elizabeth never really lived together at Buckingham Palace. That is not true. They moved there together after the death of her father in 1952. Their children grew up there. Philip had an office there. He worked on the royal estates from there. He made changes inside the building. He helped modernize parts of the palace. He even pushed for changes to the kitchens and added things that reflected his own practical way of thinking. The truth is not that he refused to live there. The truth is more interesting. He fought against moving there. He argued against it strongly, and he lost. Then he spent the next 65 years living in the very building he had never wanted to enter as his permanent home. Finally, in 2017, at the age of 96, he retired from public life and left. Think about that. At around 30 years old, he argued that Buckingham Palace was not the right place to live. At 96, when he was finally free from his official duties, he packed his things and went elsewhere. That does not necessarily prove anger or bitterness, but it does show something important. A decision that began when he was a young man lasted almost his entire adult life. Now, back to the ring. In December 1944, Philip's father died in a hotel room in Monte Carlo. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, had spent his final years in difficult circumstances. He was living apart from his wife and had very little money left. Philip was 23 at the time and serving in the Royal Navy. He had not seen his father since before the war. After his father's death, a small collection of belongings was sent back. There were clothes, some personal papers, a wooden shaving brush, and a signet ring. That was almost everything. This was the inheritance left by a man who had been born a prince of 2 countries. Philip took the ring and began wearing it, and he kept wearing it, through his wedding, through the coronation, through decades of royal events, through state visits, ceremonies, factory openings, dinners, tours, and hundreds of thousands of handshakes. Even in photographs taken when he was an old man, the ring can still be seen on the little finger of his left hand. By then, it had become worn down. The design and crest were fading after years of use, but he still wore it. And that matters because almost everything else in his life came through the royal family he married into. His position came through Elizabeth. His home came through Elizabeth. His public role came through Elizabeth. Even his children's family name would eventually be decided by Elizabeth's side of the institution. That ring was different. It came from his own father. It was one of the few physical connections he had to the family he had lost. Keep that in mind, because when we reach the events of 1952, that small piece of metal begins to carry much more weight. Now we need to go back to where their relationship started. The romance between Philip and Elizabeth was real. There is no reason to pretend otherwise. The problem is that many versions of the story stop at the wedding. But in many ways, the wedding was where the hardest part of Philip's life truly began. They met properly in July 1939 at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. Elizabeth was 13, Philip was 18. He was tall, confident, athletic, and exactly the kind of young man who could easily catch the attention of a teenage girl. Accounts from the time say Elizabeth watched him closely during the visit and talked about him afterwards. They had technically crossed paths before. In 1934, they were both present at the wedding of Princess Marina and the Duke of Kent, but Dartmouth was the moment that mattered. Then the war came. Philip went away to serve. Letters began moving between them. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. When Philip wrote to Elizabeth, where exactly did he consider home? Where was he supposed to go when he was granted leave? The answer was difficult. Because Philip barely had a stable home at all. His father was living far away and had largely disappeared from his everyday life. His mother, Princess Alice, had suffered a serious mental breakdown years earlier and spent time receiving treatment. During the war, she was in occupied Athens, where she helped shelter a Jewish family. Years later, she would be honored by Israel for that act. Philip's 4 sisters had married and were living in Germany. The Greek monarchy connected to his family had collapsed. When Philip was only a baby, his family had been forced to leave Corfu. He was taken away on a British ship, and one famous account describes him being carried in a makeshift cot made from an orange box. From the beginning, his life involved movement. Different countries, different relatives, different homes, different schools. During holidays, he often stayed with relatives or with school friends whose families gave him a place to stay. He had a trunk. He had a bicycle. And he had no single place that truly belonged to him. Then a young princess at Windsor began writing letters to him, and that changed something. Elizabeth was not just a girl he cared about. Windsor represented stability. For a man who had spent much of his life moving between families and countries, it was one fixed point. That does not mean he did not love her. By all serious accounts, he did. People who knew them personally consistently described a genuine and lasting bond. But another truth existed beside that love. Philip had very little else that was secure, and people around him understood that. There was also another tragedy from his youth that followed him for the rest of his life. In November 1937, a plane crashed near Ostend in Belgium during heavy fog. Everyone on board died. Among the dead was Philip's sister Cecile. She was only 26 years old and 8 months pregnant. Her husband also died. 2 of their young sons died as well. Philip was 16. He traveled to Darmstadt in Germany for the funeral. There is a photograph from that day, and that image would become deeply important later. It shows a teenage Philip walking behind his sister's coffin through a German town. Around him were men in uniform. And those uniforms created a problem that Philip could never completely escape. Cecile's husband had joined the Nazi Party. Some of the people connected to that family were also associated with the Nazi movement. Philip had not chosen those marriages. He had been a child when his sisters married. During the Second World War, he served Britain in the Royal Navy. He was mentioned in dispatches after the Battle of Cape Matapan. He was present in Tokyo Bay during the Japanese surrender. His wartime service was real. But when his marriage to the future queen became a serious possibility in 1946 and 1947, his military record was not the only thing people remembered. There were also those photographs, the funeral, the German connections within his family. That was another burden he carried into the royal household. One inheritance from his father was a ring. Another was a collection of family connections and images that he could never fully separate himself from. And then came the price of marrying Elizabeth. Philip gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles. He gave up his position connected to the Greek throne. He changed his religion from Greek Orthodoxy to the Church of England. He became a British citizen, and he took a surname. That last part is especially important. Philip had not used a normal family surname in the way most people do. The name chosen for him was Mountbatten. It was the English form of Battenberg, the surname connected to his mother's family. That name itself had already been changed during the First World War because a German-sounding name had become politically uncomfortable in Britain. So look at the strange path of it. Philip entered British royal life under a surname that had already been altered for political reasons. Then, only a few years after his marriage, even that name would become a source of conflict. The engagement was announced in July 1947. The engagement ring Philip gave Elizabeth contained a large diamond surrounded by smaller stones. Those diamonds came from a tiara belonging to his mother. Princess Alice had it broken apart so that the stones could be used. She had little to give him, but she gave what she had. That moment stands out. For much of Philip's life, he would give things up in order to enter Elizabeth's world. This was one of the rare moments when someone from his own family gave him something that could become part of the life he was building. They married on November 20th, 1947, at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests attended. Millions listened through radio broadcasts. Elizabeth even used rationed coupons toward her wedding dress, reflecting the restrictions that still existed after the war. On the morning of the wedding, King George VI gave Philip several titles. He became the Duke of Edinburgh. He was also made Earl of Merioneth and Baron Greenwich. But something important was missing. He was not made a Prince of the United Kingdom. Philip had been born a Prince of Greece and Denmark. He had given those titles up. Yet the British version of that title did not come with his marriage. It did not come when his children were born. It did not come when Elizabeth became queen. It would not arrive until 1957, 10 years after the wedding. And there was another painful detail. None of Philip's sisters attended the wedding. Not one. 3 of them were alive. They could have come. But 2 years after the end of the Second World War, the royal household believed that having Philip's German relatives connected to former Nazi circles inside Westminster Abbey would create a serious public problem. So they were excluded. You have to picture what that meant. Inside the Abbey were kings, queens, prime ministers, and members of royal families from across Europe. Elizabeth's family filled the building. On Philip's side, his mother was there. She sat in a gray religious habit, connected to the religious order she had founded. And she was largely alone. Philip's immediate family had effectively been kept away from one of the biggest days of his life. He never publicly complained about it. In that generation, especially inside that family, silence was often the preferred response. And to be fair, the decision did not come from nowhere. The war had ended only 2 years earlier. The world had just learned the full scale of the Nazi concentration camps. The royal household could not simply ignore those political and emotional realities. The people making the decision may have believed they were doing what was necessary, but understanding why something happened does not remove the pain of being the person affected by it. Philip was still the one standing there without his sisters. The marriage began with him entering Westminster Abbey under a name chosen through political necessity, wearing a ring inherited from his dead father, with only one close member of his immediate family beside him. And then the next part of his life began. The small decisions, the quiet judgments, the things that were rarely dramatic enough to make headlines but could still shape a person over time. Elizabeth's mother was reportedly not enthusiastic about Philip as a match. His German family connections were a major reason. Several biographies have reported that he was privately referred to using the insult, the Hun. There is no recording of the Queen Mother saying it publicly, but the story has appeared in more than one serious account of that household and was never publicly corrected. Imagine what that kind of atmosphere could feel like. Not necessarily an open insult, not a shouting match. Just a room full of people who all understand what is being said without anyone actually saying it directly to your face. Philip was 26 years old. He had spent the war serving Britain. He had been shot at. He had lost close family members, and yet he still had to deal with questions about whether he truly belonged inside the family he was about to join. According to many accounts, he rarely gave people the reaction they may have expected. He absorbed it. He stayed controlled. He moved forward. Then, in February 1952, everything changed. Before we reach that moment, though, it is important to remember that Philip and Elizabeth did have genuinely happy years. From 1949 to 1951, Philip was stationed in Malta with the Mediterranean Fleet. Elizabeth joined him there. For a time, their lives were relatively normal. They lived at Villa Guardamangia near Valletta. Elizabeth did not yet have the full weight of the crown on her shoulders. She had fewer official duties. She could move around more freely. She drove herself. She visited local places. She watched Philip play polo. Philip also received his own naval command. By most accounts, those years in Malta were among the happiest of their marriage. People who knew Elizabeth then described a different version of her, more relaxed, more spontaneous, less controlled by the expectations that would later define almost every public moment of her life. For a short time, they were simply a young married couple. Then, one phone call changed everything. In February 1952, Philip and Elizabeth were in Kenya representing her father during a Commonwealth tour. King George VI was too ill to travel. The couple spent one night at Treetops, a famous lodge built above a watering hole. While they were there, George VI died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham during the early hours of February 6th. The news reached the people around Elizabeth before it reached her, and Philip was told first. His private secretary, Mike Parker, informed him away from the main building. Parker later described Philip as looking as if an enormous weight had suddenly fallen on him, not because his father-in-law had died, but because he immediately understood what the death meant. Everything was about to change. Philip took Elizabeth aside and told her himself. They spent time together before returning to the others. From that moment, the marriage they had known was over. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because the institution surrounding them suddenly took control of nearly every part of their lives. Elizabeth became queen, and Philip's position changed instantly. From that point forward, he walked behind her at official events. Her private secretaries worked for her. Her government papers belonged to her official role. The decisions of the crown did not pass through him. Philip had commanded a warship before turning 30. He had built a career through his own ability. Then, at 31, that career ended. He never returned to the Navy. The one profession that was entirely his, the one place where he had earned his position through service and skill, disappeared from his future. He was 30 years old. He would live to 99. That means he spent roughly 69 years unable to return to the career he had been trained for. Decades later, another young outsider would enter the same royal institution and discover how powerful its rules could be. Diana would be told where to stand, what to wear, when to speak, and how to behave. The instructions were often delivered politely. But politeness does not always make control easier to live with. And one of the few people inside that family who understood what it felt like to enter an institution and slowly lose control over major parts of your own life had experienced something very similar in 1952. That will matter later. Now we come back to the house. Before becoming queen, Elizabeth and Philip had been living at Clarence House. Philip had been heavily involved in making it their home. He cared about the details. He worked on the practical side of the building. He chose fittings. He argued about improvements. He had a workshop there. It was one of the first homes in his adult life that truly contained signs of his own personality. Then Elizabeth became queen, and everyone around them treated the move to Buckingham Palace as unavoidable. Philip disagreed, strongly. He argued that Clarence House was a real working home. Buckingham Palace, in his view, was too large and too formal. He believed it was a place designed for official duties rather than family life. He questioned whether it was the right environment for raising two young children. He also believed that too many decisions inside the palace were controlled by courtiers who had their own ideas about how the royal family should live. But the people around the new queen did not agree. The government supported the move. The royal household supported the move. Elizabeth eventually supported the decision. They moved into Buckingham Palace in May 1952. Philip lost. He had already lost his naval career. Now he lost the argument over where his family would live. And his mother-in-law later moved into Clarence House, the home he had spent years helping shape. At this point, it is difficult to know exactly what Philip was thinking. Perhaps he believed each disagreement was separate. Perhaps he thought he could still win the next one. But what happened soon after suggests he understood that something much bigger was taking place. There was one thing he still believed belonged to him: his name. Under the traditional custom of the time, a married woman generally took her husband's family name. Their children normally carried their father's surname. Philip and Elizabeth already had 2 children. Charles was 3, Anne was 18 months old. Philip believed that their surname would be Mountbatten. At that point, nobody had formally told him otherwise. Then the issue exploded. And the remarkable thing is that the fight began at a dinner Philip was not even attending. The courtiers running Buckingham Palace in 1952 had served previous monarchs. Some had worked for Elizabeth's father. Others had experience stretching back to earlier generations. They saw Philip as young, modern, energetic, and sometimes difficult to control. Over time, he would manage to change certain things. He modernized systems. He pushed for practical reforms. He changed parts of the way the palace operated. But one thing remained clear. Many people inside the institution still viewed him as someone who had entered his wife's world, not as an equal owner of it. Then Lord Louis Mountbatten entered the story. Mountbatten was Philip's uncle and one of the most influential figures in British public life. He had played a major role in Philip's journey toward becoming a British royal. He helped guide him. He assisted with the process surrounding his naturalization. The Mountbatten name had become part of Philip's new identity. And after Elizabeth became queen, Mountbatten reportedly made a public comment suggesting that the House of Mountbatten was now the reigning house. That sentence did not stay private for long. News of it reached Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, and Queen Mary had very strong feelings about royal names. She had personally lived through the First World War, when the British royal family had changed its name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor because of anti-German feeling. She understood exactly how politically dangerous a family name could become, and she was not related to Philip in the direct family sense. To her, the British royal house was Windsor. The idea that it could suddenly become associated with Mountbatten created immediate opposition. What happened next is where this story becomes extraordinary. Instead of being discussed privately between Philip and Elizabeth, the issue moved upward. Queen Mary involved her private secretary. The matter reached Winston Churchill's office. Then the government became involved. Suddenly, the surname of Philip's children was not a discussion between a husband and wife. It was a matter being handled by the state. Philip was not part of the discussions. He was not asked to explain his position. He was not invited into the room. No one was negotiating with him directly. Men in government and senior figures around the crown were deciding what would happen to his name. Then came April 9, 1952. Elizabeth made a formal declaration in council. In simple terms, it was an official statement made by the sovereign in front of the Privy Council. Once recorded, it became the formal position of the crown. The declaration stated that Elizabeth and her children would belong to the house and family of Windsor. Her descendants would use the Windsor name. One decision, one official document, only weeks after she had become queen. Philip's children would not automatically carry his surname. The royal house would not take his name. And the decision was final. Elizabeth was only 25 years old. She had been queen for less than 2 months. Her grandmother opposed Philip's position. The Prime Minister's government had made its view clear. It is easy, decades later, to ask why Elizabeth did not simply refuse, but it is also worth remembering the position she had suddenly inherited. She was a young woman at the beginning of an enormous reign, surrounded by experienced politicians, senior advisors, and a royal system that had existed long before she took the throne. Still, the document was signed. And for Philip, the result was devastating. He later made one of the few comments that revealed how deeply it affected him. He reportedly said, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba." Then came the sentence that explained the real issue. He said he was the only man in the country who was not allowed to give his name to his own children. That was the part that hurt. Not a royal title, not a ceremony, not public attention. His children. In ordinary families across Britain, fathers passed their surnames to their children without needing approval from the government. Philip could not. The rule had been changed specifically because he had married the future queen, and the decision had been put into official form. This is the darker side of the marriage. There was no dramatic affair at the center of it, no famous screaming match, no legal separation, no lawyers fighting through the courts. Much of the damage was created through official decisions, tradition, paperwork, and silence. And the most important decision came during the first 8 weeks of Elizabeth's reign. After that, both of them lived with the consequences for decades. Every family event came after that document. Every christening, every wedding, every public ceremony, every time their children signed their names. The original decision remained in the background. There was no immediate reversal, no public apology, no grand speech explaining what had happened. The years simply continued. And that brings us back to the ring. By this point, you can understand why it may have mattered so much. Philip's home came through the royal family. His role came through the royal family. His public identity had been shaped by the royal family. His children carried the Windsor name, but the signet ring on his hand came from his own father. It had arrived in a trunk from Monte Carlo alongside a shaving brush and a few personal possessions. Philip never publicly explained what the ring meant to him. Nobody can honestly claim to know his private thoughts, but he wore it for the rest of his life. And when you look at everything else he had surrendered, changed, or lost, it becomes easier to understand why he may have held on to the few things that still connected him to where he came from. The next chapter takes this story even further, because only a year later, Philip would kneel before his own wife during her coronation in front of millions of people. Then, years after losing the fight over his children's surname, a compromise would finally bring the name Mountbatten Windsor into the royal family. But even then, the victory would not be complete, and the person who would eventually give Philip one of the clearest signs that his name still mattered would be his daughter, Princess Anne. The next major moment came on June 2, 1953. It was Elizabeth's coronation at Westminster Abbey. Around 8,000 people were inside the Abbey, while roughly 27 million people watched on television. It was one of the biggest broadcasts Britain had ever seen. Elizabeth was being crowned queen. Philip was not being crowned. That part was expected. A husband of a reigning queen did not receive a crown or a throne of his own. But what happened during the ceremony showed just how completely Philip's position had changed. After Elizabeth was crowned, the ceremony moved into the ancient act of homage. One by one, senior men of the kingdom approached the monarch, knelt before her, placed their hands between hers, and swore loyalty. Philip went first, ahead of the archbishops, ahead of the dukes, ahead of the other senior figures in the kingdom. He walked toward his wife in his robes, removed his coronet, and knelt before her. Then he made his oath. He promised to become her loyal man, in life and in service. It was an old ceremony, but the meaning was powerful. Philip had once been a prince in his own right. He had served in the Navy. He had commanded a warship. He had built a career through his own work. Now millions of people were watching him kneel before his wife and formally declare his loyalty to her as sovereign. He then stood, touched the crown on her head, kissed her cheek, and walked backward away from her. He was 32 years old. They had been married for about 5.5 years, and he performed every part of the ceremony perfectly. That was Philip's great skill. Whatever he felt inside, he rarely allowed the public to see it. Most people watching that day saw devotion. They saw a husband supporting his wife. They saw a powerful royal couple. Very few would have thought about the strange position of the man kneeling there. Just over a year earlier, an official declaration had ensured that his own children would carry the Windsor name instead of his. Now he was publicly swearing loyalty to the woman whose family had made that decision, and he did it without protest. The story did not end there. Philip had surrendered his Greek and Danish titles before the wedding, yet he still had not been made a British prince. Charles was born. Anne was born. Elizabeth became queen. Elizabeth was crowned. Still, Philip remained the Duke of Edinburgh rather than a prince of the United Kingdom. The people around the crown knew exactly why. His wife's mother and grandmother had opposed giving him the title. Queen Mary died in March 1953. The Queen Mother remained influential for decades. Eventually, in February 1957, Philip was finally given the title Prince of the United Kingdom. 10 years had passed since his wedding. By that point, the title could hardly feel like a simple gift. It came after years of being treated as something he had to earn. And that same year, another problem became public. Philip had been away for months on a long Commonwealth tour aboard the royal yacht. 4 months is a long time for any married couple to spend apart. The press noticed. Rumors began spreading. Soon newspapers were talking about trouble inside the marriage. There were claims of a rift, claims that they were living separate lives, claims that the marriage was failing. Buckingham Palace almost never responded directly to stories like that. Its usual method was silence, but in February 1957, the palace broke that rule. A formal statement denied that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. That was unusual. The royal household normally avoided confirming or denying private stories. This time, it decided the rumors had gone too far. The statement did not prove that the marriage had always been easy, but there was no solid evidence that Philip was having an affair or that the couple were preparing to separate. The palace was defending the marriage publicly. Then, 3 years later, something finally changed regarding the family name. On February 8, 1960, Elizabeth issued an order in council. It stated that her descendants who did not have a royal style would use the surname Mountbatten Windsor. That was a significant change, but it was not everything Philip had wanted. Charles and Anne, who had been at the center of the original dispute in 1952, remained Windsor. The change applied mainly to descendants who did not hold a royal style. So Philip had finally succeeded in getting Mountbatten connected to the royal family. But his 2 oldest children, the children whose names had caused the original argument, did not receive that name. It had taken 8 years just to get the compromise into the official record. By then, Queen Mary was gone. Winston Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. The people who had pushed the original decision were no longer in the same positions. The battle had changed because the circumstances had changed. And the first major public appearance of the combined name came years later. On November 14, 1973, Princess Anne married Mark Phillips at Westminster Abbey. When she signed the marriage register, she used the name Anne Mountbatten Windsor. Her father was nearby. For Philip, that must have been a remarkable moment. His daughter was using his family name on an official document in front of the world. It was not the dramatic victory that might appear in a film. There was no speech, no public celebration of an old argument being settled, just a young woman choosing how to sign her name. But it was probably the closest thing Philip ever received to a personal victory in that dispute. And it had taken 26 years. Then came another young outsider. On July 29, 1981, 19-year-old Diana Spencer married Prince Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral. Philip was there. He had spent 3 decades learning what it meant to marry into the institution. Now he was watching another young woman enter the same world. Diana's experience would eventually become one of the most painful stories in modern royal history. Her marriage broke down publicly. The pressure became enormous. And surprisingly, one of the people who communicated with Diana during that difficult period was Philip. His letters to her have been described by people who knew about them. They were not simply cold instructions from an older royal. They were often thoughtful and personal. Philip tried to understand what Diana was experiencing. He also became frustrated with her choices, particularly when he believed those choices were damaging Charles. Their correspondence was not perfect. It was not always gentle. But he wrote to her when many others inside the institution struggled to reach her. There was something they had in common. Both had entered the royal family from outside. Both had been expected to adapt. Both had discovered that the institution had its own rules, and that those rules were often stronger than individual wishes. That may explain why Philip understood Diana in ways other members of the family could not. Someone once described the royal family's treatment of outsiders in a way that stayed with me. The institution does not necessarily destroy the people who marry into it. Sometimes it simply refuses to make enough room for them. Then, when they struggle, everyone wonders why. Philip had experienced that process decades before Diana. And after Diana died in 1997, Philip again found himself trying to protect the younger generation. During the days between Diana's death and her funeral, there was a major question surrounding her two sons. William was 15, Harry was 12. Should they walk behind their mother's coffin through central London in front of enormous crowds? There were concerns about what that experience could do to two grieving boys. Eventually, Philip helped settle the question. He spoke to William and reportedly told him that if he chose not to walk, he might regret it later. Then he offered something even more important. He asked William whether he would walk if Philip walked beside him. Philip was 76 years old. He did not have to be in that procession, but he chose to stand beside his grandson. That meant William would not be alone. So the same man who had once entered the royal family as an outsider, carrying very little of his own, later walked through London beside a 15-year-old boy who had just lost his mother. He did not make a speech about it. He did not later use the moment to defend himself. He simply did it. That is one of the things that makes Philip difficult to understand through simple labels. He could be blunt. He could be impatient. He could make comments that shocked people. But he also had a strong sense of duty and loyalty toward the people he considered his own. Then, in 2017, his public life finally came to an end. Buckingham Palace announced that the Duke of Edinburgh would stop carrying out official engagements. He was 95. His final solo engagement was a parade involving the Royal Marines outside Buckingham Palace. He stood in the rain without a coat. After that, he retired. He moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. It was a completely different environment from Buckingham Palace. It was smaller, quieter, more private. There were only a few bedrooms, a modest kitchen, fields outside. He took his books and personal belongings with him. He spent time painting, reading, and focusing on carriage driving. The Queen continued her duties. She remained at Windsor and elsewhere while Philip lived much more privately in Norfolk. They were apart physically, but people who saw them during those final years consistently described their relationship as stable. They spoke. They visited each other. They remained connected. Still, the public created another story. Some people believed Philip had deliberately left the Queen's side because he had finally had enough. He had served for decades. He had attended hundreds of thousands of engagements. He had shaken countless hands. He had lived almost his entire adult life inside a system that had never quite belonged to him. So according to that theory, once nobody could force him to continue, he walked away to make a final statement. The story became especially popular online. People began presenting it almost as fact. But there is a problem. There is no strong evidence that this was why Philip retired. He was 96 years old. He had spent decades working. At that age, wanting privacy and rest is hardly surprising. Then came April 9, 2021. Philip died at Windsor Castle. He was 99. And the date created the strange connection I mentioned at the beginning. April 9, 1952. The declaration that kept the Mountbatten name away from his children. April 9, 2021. Philip's death. Nearly 69 years apart. He had spent 73 years married to Elizabeth. They had survived wars, political changes, family disputes, public scandals, and enormous pressure. Yet the most famous image from his funeral showed something very simple. The funeral took place during strict restrictions on gatherings. Only 30 people could attend. St. George's Chapel could have held hundreds. Instead, Elizabeth sat alone. There was empty space around her. She was 94 years old. Her husband of 73 years was being buried. The image of the Queen sitting by herself became one of the defining photographs of the funeral. For many people, it changed how they looked at the marriage. Whatever difficulties Philip and Elizabeth had experienced, whatever disagreements had existed between them, this was still a woman saying goodbye to the man who had been beside her for most of her adult life. And that brings us to the final piece. After Philip's death, his children took part in a television documentary. The interviewer asked directly about the idea that Philip had retired to Norfolk because he wanted to make a statement against the Queen. Princess Anne answered, and her response is important. She explained that her father had simply reached an age where he wanted somewhere quiet. He wanted to be able to move around a farm without people constantly watching him. It was a denial of the idea that he had left his wife out of spite. But there was something else about Anne's answer. She did not have to answer that question. She was known for being extremely careful in public interviews. She rarely encouraged speculation. She often gave short answers and moved on. This time, she addressed the rumor directly. That matters, because it shows how strongly the public had come to believe the opposite story. People had created a narrative in which Philip spent decades waiting for the moment he could finally walk away from the Queen. Anne rejected that. Her explanation was much simpler. Her father was old. He had worked almost his entire life. He wanted somewhere private. He wanted to walk outside without crowds. He wanted a quieter existence. And perhaps that simple explanation makes the final chapter more powerful. Think about everything Philip had lived through. He had lost his country. He had lost his royal titles. He had changed his religion. He had taken a new nationality. He had adopted a new surname. He had lost his naval career at 30. He had moved into a palace he did not want. He had watched his children receive the Windsor name instead of his. He had knelt before his wife during her coronation. He had spent decades working inside an institution where he would always be second to the crown, and yet he kept going. He did not leave the marriage. He did not abandon public duty. He stayed beside Elizabeth for more than 7 decades. Then, when he was finally old enough to choose how he spent his remaining years, he chose a farm, not another palace, not another grand residence, a quiet place, somewhere he could walk outside, somewhere nobody needed him to perform a role. That does not prove that he had forgotten the hurt of 1952. We cannot know what he privately felt about that declaration. He never gave the public a clear answer. Perhaps he forgave it. Perhaps he accepted that Elizabeth had been trapped by the system around her. Perhaps he simply decided that carrying the anger was no longer worth it. Or perhaps some part of him never completely forgot. What we do know is that the official decision remained. His children were Windsor. Later generations could use Mountbatten Windsor under the rules that followed. But the original page was never erased. And that is why the story of Philip's name is more important than it first appears. This was not simply an argument over a surname. It was about identity. Philip had spent his early life without a stable home. He lost his father. He was separated from his mother. His family scattered across Europe. He served a country that was not technically his own. Then he gave up the royal identity he had been born with to marry Elizabeth. He accepted a new country, a new church, a new title, a new surname. And finally, when he believed his children would carry that surname, the institution changed the rules. Yet he stayed. He built a life around service. He supported Elizabeth. He helped modernize the monarchy. He worked for decades, and he became one of the longest-serving consorts in British history. That is why the small ring matters. It was one of the few things he carried that did not come from the institution. It belonged to the man he had been before he became Prince Philip. It came from his father. It survived every change. The titles disappeared. The countries changed. The surname changed. The job changed. The homes changed. But the ring remained. And perhaps that is the most human part of the whole story. We often remember royal lives through crowns, palaces, ceremonies, and official titles. But sometimes the smallest personal object tells us more. A ring, a name, a signature, a quiet decision to retire. Those are the details that show us the person underneath the role. Philip gave up a throne, a church, a country, and the identity he had been born with in order to marry Elizabeth. The family he joined then spent decades deciding exactly how much of his identity could remain inside the crown. And still, he stayed beside her. At the end of his life, when nobody could order him to continue working, he chose a quiet farm. Maybe that was not revenge. Maybe it was simply the first time in decades that Philip could choose where he wanted to be. And perhaps that is the final question worth leaving with. After everything that happened in 1952, did Philip ever truly forgive the people who took his name away from his children? There is no document that answers it. No final confession. No dramatic confrontation. Only the choices he made for the rest of his life. And sometimes, those choices tell us more than words ever could. The story did not end with a public fight. It ended with a man who had spent almost 70 years carrying out his duty, finally choosing a quiet place where he could live without being watched. And maybe, after giving so much of himself to the crown, that was the one decision that was finally his.